With infinite complacence, people went to and fro over the earth about their little affairs, serene in the assurance of their dominion over this small, spinning fragment of solar driftwood, which by chance or design man has inherited out of the dark mystery of time and space.
So on this episode of Into the Fray, I welcome Heather on with me, and she got in touch. She's got what I have been lovingly referring to as, I guess, essentially the shining. She has the shine to her, and that is in that she's like a moth, or rather, she is the flame, and then she's got all these moths that are like, look at her. She's cool and interesting, and I want to interact with her and show myself to her, and her email she sent along, which I very much appreciate, Heather. Thank you, was very detailed. It went through all of her experiences, and I already know that her experiences are in the same vein as someone like Debbie or Shanna or Tina and Laura, of free will healing. And I'm very much looking forward to digging into all of this in detail. Heather, welcome on the show. And also, if you would please let everybody know your professional background and all of the things that you have you've attained in your life. You've been busy.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm excited to be here. I've been listening for 4 or 5 years now. So yeah, I am what I call an environmental social scientist. So I have a bachelor's in psychology, and I was a social worker for 13 years. I worked in community mental health as well as for-profit medical care, like emergency medical social work. And then I kind of burned out of that, decided to study environmental science. And so I got my master's in 2023 in geography with an emphasis in urban climate change mitigation. So sometimes when I tell people that, they assume that means I'm a climate scientist. I'm not, because I study people and how people interact with and relate to their environment, especially in an urban setting. Very concerned about our ongoing climate crisis. So looking at how we can relate to nature better and really enhance urban design to bring temperatures down in cities. So that's what I do.
So what I am a little bit curious about that, just to digress right out of the gate. I mean, what's the tone of all of those kinds of studies? Are we kind of screwed there, or what's going on, with the whole urban situation and our climate?
Yeah, so something I think people fail to realize is that the climate crisis globally is really centered around the urban dweller. And even though it affects our oceans, our forests, a lot of it comes from cities. Cities are hotter than the surrounding rural environments because of impermeable surfaces, aka concrete, and dark roofs, anything that's a dark, unnatural surface that traps heat. So a lot of our climate crisis is literally coming out of cities, and especially big cities. You think New York City, Tokyo, which actually Tokyo probably does better at mitigating, but any big city. Not only do you have smog, which is a totally different issue, but we have what we call urban heat islands. If you read the news, you notice every year during summers all across the globe that we have rising numbers of heat deaths. The thing is it is preventable. It is preventable if we were willing to spend more money on better design that brings in plants and nature at all levels of the design. So if that, strikes anyone's curiosity, you could look up Singapore. Singapore does an amazing job at weaving nature into their urban designs at all levels by literally not only growing up the sides of buildings, but all over the rooftops, and even sometimes creating ecosystems in the middle of buildings. So that's what we need to be doing. I wish that we could move more towards that. The United States is especially bad at this, and which is why you read about heat deaths every year, billions of dollars in damage and catastrophe that could be prevented. So when you say, are we screwed? It is it is a depressing thing to study and be a part of, but there's hope and there are solutions. It's just getting, the consensus and people to move in that direction. It's expensive, so it all comes down to dollar signs.
Mm-hmm. The usual, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. How about, and this also is something that, like anything else, is up to you how much you want to share. But I love it because in your email, you're like, I also have a woo-woo side, right? You have your very scientific driven side, but also your woo-woo side. Do you want to tell everybody that, your accomplishments on that side and some of your practices on that side of things?
Yeah, so I do identify as a pagan witch. I have a really solitary practice. But what's funny is you get a lot of very materialist scientists who don't think that those two things go together. You can't be a social scientist and study the environment and also be a witch. You absolutely can. I like to say that magic and science are the same thing. They're both trying to explain the unseen and the unknown. So I would say that my understanding of science and my master's degree and my interest in the environment absolutely bolsters my magic practice. It uses different vocabulary. It looks at things through a different lens, but it's really just two sides of the same coin. So I think it's funny when people try to tell me that they can't go together. Um, I would say that my spiritual practices did evolve out of my paranormal experiences. Being able to, witness the quote unquote unseen, or, being able to experience things that our normal everyday physics can't quite explain, has led me to believe that there is something beyond the veil, something around us all the time that we can't see, that might even be, driving part of our reality or making decisions behind the scenes. And so I choose in my magical practice to call upon that and interact with it. And it has been nothing but beautiful and fun. Something that I like to do especially is celebrate the seasons. So my family, my partner and my kids and I, like, we really celebrate like the equinoxes, the solstices, and just seasonal shifts and changes. It's really just earth-based spiritual.
So, what about some misnomers that come along with being a pagan witch? Has anyone ever said to you, "Oh, I bet no one messes with you because you're a witch and you'll cast spells on people"? Like, what are some of the common things that come up when people find out that you're a pagan witch?
Well, I mean, if you look at our mainstream Christian culture, they think paganism equals Satan worship, which is the most hilarious thing ever because that's not true. And, pagans don't believe in that duality of there being God and devil, right? Like, we look at it all as being a continuum, and, you know, more as neutral, right? Like, they're forces of nature that exist, but I certainly don't believe in any idea of a devil or Satan, and there's no Satan worship. There's no, sacrificing animals. So it's this intense misunderstanding. And when I start to tell people, um, like, most Christian holidays come from pagan traditions. Like, Christmas used to be the celebration of the solstice. So I always go there. I'm like, let's talk about what you celebrate every year. Before it was taken over by Christianity, these were earth-based seasonal practices. So all I have done is strip them back down to their roots. So we're actually doing the same thing. We're just using different language. Um, so I try to be understanding that people they just don't know. It's not part of the mainstream. And I do think that our modern Christianity has really tried to taint and stain what paganism and earth-based spirituality was originally. Yeah, I definitely think that there's a creep factor with some people. I used to not talk about it at all, but I've gotten more and more comfortable with just telling people what I do and explaining it to them and letting them ask questions. I don't think anyone thinks, I'm going to cast a spell on them or anything like that, but it's there's probably a little bit of concern when they when they want to hear more about it.
I love it. You're like, don't make me flex those muscles. Do not mess with me. I mean, okay, so Heather, let's just for fun say, that you were that kind of person. You were just like, you know what? I just don't like your face. So I'm going to cast a spell on you. Or, I mean, could you do that? Could you affect someone's life if you really wanted to?
Um, so I have twice in my life put an intention into making something happen for a person, one of them not good when I was 14 and one of them really good, and they both happened. Now, does that mean I did it? I don't know. I can't prove that. No, and if any practicing pagan tells you that they can, I don't know that you really can quote unquote prove it. I don't need to. So maybe I don't really mess around and stuff like that. I think that's where things could start going wrong. So an interesting piece of my spiritual practice in paganism is it's also very infused with Buddhist and yogic theory and philosophy as well. So I believe in karma. I don't think that I should necessarily mess around in people's lives. So I don't know.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. All right, so let's dive in here. Let's go back to when you were 16 years old in 1999.
Okay. Yeah. So, I've had experiences for as long as I can remember, probably going back to infancy, but I can't start my story there because something happened when I was 16 that woke me up. So, and I remember the exact day because it really changed my life. It was Sunday, April 4th, 1999, and I was 16 years old. It was the end of my 11th grade year. I lived in Fort Smith, Arkansas, which is the third largest city in Arkansas. It's right on the Oklahoma border. I was born and raised there. I actually lived there for 32 years. And I was hanging out that day with my boyfriend at the time and an older friend. And we had just been out roaming around like young, aimless kids do. And we had gotten back to my boyfriend's parents' house. And so it had been a really clear, nice, warm spring day. And we were sitting outside. We all were cigarette smokers at the time. So, to tell you a little bit about this piece of property, my boyfriend's parents they were wealthy and they had a really large piece of rural property. It was right on the outskirts of the city. They had a really huge, sprawling ranch style house with this really large stone carport that held 4 vehicles. I'm not even sure how many acres they had, but they had a pond, they had a barn, just a really huge piece of property. And this was in an area which is now built up into subdivisions as, the city grew over time. But at the time, the houses were really spread apart. And so, each house had multiple acres and you could hardly even see neighbors at the time. So we're sitting outside, we're sitting under this stone carport. There's 2 wooden benches. I'm sitting on the one that's out facing this barn, and the guys are sitting on the bench that's facing me and looking out to a different part of the yard. And so I kind of want to describe everything. So you have to understand everything happened fast, but I have over the years, tried to sit and meditate on what all happened and how it happened. 3 large dogs. One of them was a German Shepherd. The other 2 were just kind of mutts. They lived outside and the family used them as basically guard dogs. They were not really pets. They lived in the barn. They ate their food in the barn. I mean, they were beloved work dogs, basically. And they had never been in the house, never been allowed to be in the house. And usually when you were outside, they would follow you around. They weren't in any way aggressive to us or the family, but they were absolutely aggressive to everybody else. I mean, they would bark and go crazy if anybody came close to the property. And that was their whole purpose. But all of a sudden, we're sitting there, we're smoking our cigarettes, and these dogs come up all together and they have their tails tucked between their legs and they are whimpering and they put themselves at the front door of the house, which they had never done. And so we were all really puzzled. And myself and the guys commented, like, what is up with dogs and what are they trying to do? So it was a little disturbing. And so I was kind of picking up that something was happening. All of a sudden, the air felt thicker. It went from being totally clear to like having this greenish hue. it felt like static electricity. All the hair on the back of my neck and my arms stood up. And then all of a sudden, this incredibly bright light starts coming down into the tree line above this barn. And, I'm facing it, the guys are not facing it. And I didn't say anything immediately because I was watching what it was doing. So, some things about it, it was not huge. It was incredibly bright, kind of hard to look at. So, it was more of an orb. It was definitely in a round shape. It didn't look like a craft. I didn't see necessarily like physical craft shape, but it was moving with intention. And I intuitively knew that it was bringing about those changes. I knew that's why the dogs were acting like that. And it felt like it was calling to me, which is bizarre. And I couldn't have verbalized that in the moment. But I watched it move intelligently and purposefully through this tree line very slowly until it was getting ready to obviously, I say land behind the barn. I use air quotes because I don't know that it was going to land. But as it's getting close to going back behind the barn, I say, guys, there's a UFO back there. And they just look at me blankly, like mouth kind of hanging open. And I was like, there's a UFO. There's a UFO. You need to turn around. There's a UFO. And by the time they both turned around, it had gone behind the barn and was no longer in sight. And so at that moment, I felt like something was kind of taking over my day. They're here. And I start to run towards the barn. And when I get almost all the way up towards the barn, it's like I snapped back into consciousness and I was like, what am I doing? This is terrifying. Nothing about this is normal. Like full on adrenaline rush. And I ran back towards the guys. And I think I was just kind of mumbling. I didn't even know how to tell them what had just happened to me. But they're kind of more freaked out about the dogs. We're also supposed to be quote unquote babysitting my boyfriend's little brother who was 4, which we really had no business being in charge of this kid. And he comes outside, and so my boyfriend's trying to like get him back inside, get the dogs to stop freaking out, and is trying to handle me, blabbering about there's UFO, there's a UFO. So all of this is happening all at once. And the weird thing is after it finally got out of sight behind the barn, after I ran and came back to the benches, everything clears up. There's no more weird, heavy atmosphere, no more static electricity. All that is just, it clears up immediately. So, of course, they didn't believe me. And then my boyfriend's mother comes home, a few minutes after that, and I try to tell her, and no one believes me. So it was deeply disturbing. It's the only thing I could talk about the rest of that day. So the very next day, he comes back and picks me up. So I did not drive at the time. My boyfriend did. We lived, I don't know, maybe 5 miles away from each other. He comes back to pick me up the very next day. We're driving back to his house. I don't even think that we were even talking about the incident. And this is really what kind of solidifies it as being even weirder is we're driving towards his house and an unmarked black helicopter is flying low over this rural, sparsely populated neighborhood, looking like it's looking for something. And I just lost my mind because at this point I had seen movies where that had been happening, right? Like I'd seen Independence Day, I'd seen Men in Black. I had zero interest in extraterrestrials or UFOs, but I was like, okay, this is crazy. So I make my boyfriend stop the car and I get out of the car and I'm screaming at it because I was deeply disturbed at the incident that had occurred. And this is so silly, but I was screaming at it. I was flipping it off and I was like, I know why you're here. This is a conspiracy. And I was like, well, that's it. That's it. It's looking for the UFO. It knows that it was here. And, this is insane. And so after that next day, after the low flying unmarked helicopter, that was my life changed. I really began to be incredibly paranoid, obsessed with anything that had to do with the paranormal, with abductions, with UFO for the next year and a half, unfortunately. But, one could say that maybe I was preoccupied with abduction or UFO philosophy and phenomenon, but I was not. I was just a typical 16-year-old. I mean, I was interested in music and, trendy things and, movies and TV shows. I had zero interest in UFOs or anything that had to do with it. I never thought about it. I never read any books about it. I will say I had a passive interest in witchcraft, which I think you'll might understand that later as I start to tell more of the story. But I did have interest in ghosts, and that's because I grew up in a spooky house with a really interesting family. So I did have some interest in that. But at the time, I was absolutely not connecting those things at all. So after a few days after the helicopter incident, I don't remember how many. I mean, I was absolutely just losing my mind. I already wasn't sleeping. I was terrified. I had this, I was convinced that whatever they were, and I was convinced it was a they from elsewhere, from outer space, purposely was coming to get me, which, is very paranoid, but I was a kid. So for the next year and a half, I slept with my overhead light on. I usually slept with the TV blaring. Nighttime felt very vulnerable and very scary. But I felt like I needed to do some research. I've always had a very scientific researcher brain. So I took myself to our local bookstore, took myself straight to the paranormal section, and I was like, I have to find answers. And I love telling this part of the story. And I listen to a lot of paranormal podcasts, and I've heard similar information being told over and over again. As I was looking through that bookshelf, guess what book popped out? I think, probably a lot of people already know. It was Whitley Strieber's Communion. The way that the cover of that book made me feel was also deeply disturbing. I mean, it spoke to me. I grabbed it and I didn't even need to look at anything else. I didn't need to flip through it. I was like, this is the book. It is weirdly familiar and I'm taking it home. And again, like the face of that, stereotypical gray alien had not been anything that had been in my life or in my consciousness. I wasn't holding on to that as a symbol or anything, but it weirdly just called to me. So I took it home. I probably read it in 2 days. I would read over certain parts. It felt like someone was telling me a familiar bedtime story. I don't even know how to explain that. It scared the hell out of me. I was really glad that the experience that I had didn't involve actually seeing grays or being taken into a craft, but it just felt like, oh yeah, I know exactly what this guy is talking about. So I money from my grandmother. So I lived with my grandmother at the time, and I went back. I bought his other 2 books that were on the shelf, which I cannot remember the titles of right now, but one of those books is just other experiencers stories, and I start reading things that just feel so similar. But one particular line just made my brain explode, and I can't remember which book it was. I've since Googled it and tried to find it. I can't find the passage, but basically he's talking about children who claim to be abducted and different components of those experiences. And he talks a lot about masked memories. He's talking about owls, being a really common theme. But then he mentions that some kids talk about Santa Claus. And I was like, oh no, my stomach dropped. I dropped the book and I had to get paper out and start writing because that is when the floodgates opened. So I was basically transported back to a really young period in my life, definitely before kindergarten, probably between the ages of maybe 2 and 4, where I had multiple dreams where so a presence shows up in the dream. It says, Santa Claus is here. You need to keep your eyes closed really tight because you don't need to see Santa Claus. And, we're here to get you. And I remember the feeling of being levitated above my bed and floated right out of a solid window with a bright light illuminating outside. This happened on multiple occasions. I can't say how many. It was centered around 3 different windows inside of this house that I lived in. I lived in this particular house up until I was 7 years old, which was a very creepy, spooky, haunted house that I'll talk more about later. But I remember, it's crazy. How many of us actually remember dreams from when we were 2, 3, 4 years old? That's not common, and I don't remember other dreams, but I remember these because they were so disturbing and so real, and I even remember as I'm being levitated up with my eyes closed, 'cause it said, "Keep your eyes closed really tight, you don't wanna see it." I remember thinking, "Wow, this doesn't feel like a dream, I'm pretty sure that I'm fairly conscious," like, in little kid terminology, of course. And then I don't remember anything after that. I don't remember what happened after I was floated out, which would make sense, if my body or my consciousness was being controlled and taken over. I do remember being very scared, but also feeling tranquilized mentally and physically, just feeling almost like I was floating in warm goo. So very familiar and comforting, strangely. I do remember a few times of coming out of those dreams, waking up in the morning, it's light outside, but having to be woken up. I remember hearing disembodied voices saying my name repeatedly until I finally opened my eyes, and then that would be it. So it's almost as if something had to bring me out of that tranquilized state. I do have tiny snippets of memories of really long, skinny fingers, of what you might think of with really tall alien-like being, like a stereotypical illustration or, a description. So that happened multiple times, but I had not thought about these since I was a kid. I mean, I think that my conscious brain just didn't know what to do with it. I never told my family about it. It definitely made nighttime a really vulnerable time for me. So because of that, all the way up until being 16 and actually seeing this unidentified flying object, nighttime was hard for me. I know that I wet the bed a lot as a child. I know that sleep was hard for me. I mostly wanted to sleep with adults. And I mean that makes sense. So that happened multiple times, and I have since connected some interesting things about my relationship with Santa Claus. So I definitely grew up in a family that was Christian, very evangelical, conservative Christian, celebrated Jesus's birthday on Christmas, and had the Santa Claus myth. I was super uncomfortable with Santa Claus, as would make sense. I believed in Santa Claus until I was 11 years old, which was not a fun thing to deal with at school in middle school. People, I mean, most kids stop believing in Santa Claus when they're like, what? I don't know, 6, maybe 5, 6, 7. But I was convinced that Santa Claus would real, and I would try to talk to my peers about it. I'd be like, "Why don't you believe in Santa Claus? Like, I've seen Santa Claus." And they would just be like, "What are you talking about? Santa Claus is your parents." But I had this weird otherworldly understanding of what Santa Claus was. And so when people would tell me at 10, 11 years old that Santa Claus was not real, I could not put it together. Did not remember these dreams consciously, but something was planted there in my subconscious that made me truly have a different understanding of what Santa Claus was. And, during Christmas time, when I was in elementary school and my grandmother and mom would talk about Santa Claus coming, that was not okay for me. It was a very uneasy, uncomfortable, bizarre feeling. I would go outside at night in the winter around Christmas time and just look up at the sky. And again, didn't have any language as to why I was doing this, but I being coming into our house. So I was always out looking for Santa Claus, and it was just a weird issue. I also have a piece of a memory about the same time period where I was having these dreams about being taken out the window, of being strapped in a booster seat in the back seat with my mom driving, and we're driving into dark woods. It's nighttime, and I see what I called a fireball come out of the sky and go behind a wooded tree line. And I remember saying, "Mom, look, there's a fireball." And I've also heard very similar stories like this. And I remember my mom saying, "Oh, yeah," and then just blackness. But that's a pretty weird piece of a memory. Could or maybe not be connected. It feels like it might be. And then during this same time that I'm having these dreams, being pulled out of the window, this other bizarre thing starts happening that I can only describe as a weird vision of the Virgin Mary. So I would be in bed trying to go to sleep, definitely not asleep, kind of restless, and this weird, staticky, almost hologram-like figure of a kneeling Virgin Mary would pop up. And I mean, like, the stereotypical, like, nativity scene Virgin Mary, like, on her knees, hands in the prayer position with a, like a head covering. And it was she wouldn't do anything. It was almost like what you see in Star Wars when people have the hologram figure show up and they communicate. It was like staticky, it was not still. And I would shut my eyes and be like, oh, please go away. And then I would open them and she's still there. That also happened multiple times. I do not know if it's related in any way. I don't know if for some reason that vision was being sent to me to somehow comfort me because I was being taken out of my bedroom, but it was not comforting. It was very creepy. So that was also happening around the same time. So during the same time period, so this is all before kindergarten, so before 5, this is when sleep paralysis began for me as well. I have dealt with sleep paralysis from that time period up until now. I mean, it doesn't happen on anywhere near as frequent as a basis as it used to, but sleep paralysis was definitely a weekly occurrence for me all through elementary, middle school, junior high, high school, even into college, even into my 30s. And it was always the same thing. So, I mean, anyone who has sleep paralysis, your eyes open and you're sleeping and you're halfway conscious. And it was always seeing this, well, I would call it a Hatman now, like this dark, skinny, right in my periphery, kind of had like this top hat on and just kind of standing up against a corner. It never got in my face. It never said anything to me, but I always saw it lingering in the background. And it was deeply disturbing, but I just over, so many years of having the same occurrence and the same figure, I got to where I wasn't scared of it. It was just kind of like, oh, well, there's the weird dark man in the hat in the corner. But I had never heard the word Hatman until I would say maybe a decade ago. And then I was like, oh, do tell. I feel like I know what this is. And, tried to learn a little more about it, listen to some podcasts about it. And I was like, okay, that is exactly the figure that was in my periphery during sleep paralysis. And what I learned, what I've heard over and over again by other people's stories, so many anecdotes, which I think really matter when they add up, is that the Hat Man shows up in times of discord. And my family, I was mostly raised by my grandmother and grandfather. My mother had me when she was very young and was in a very abusive relationship. And there was a lot of undiagnosed mental illness in my family. Both my mom and grandmother, I believe, were bipolar. My grandmother was never diagnosed. My mother was, but they had very similar behaviors. Both my mom's brothers, had psychosis and addiction, and just there was a lot of undiagnosed mental illness in my family. So it makes sense that a hat man would show up in a family where there's a lot of discord and unhappiness. So all this, is coalescing like all at the same time. So you can kind of get a feeling of what that might do to a little kid's psyche. I've got this, pretty mentally ill family who are not dealing with their problems. And I've got this stuff that's usually going on at night. And I don't know who I can possibly talk to about it. And I'm not even thinking or consciously remembering any of this until the UFO sighting. Because, I think what we all know as experiencers is once you've had one experience in one realm, you kind of start to have more experiences, and then you start reading more literature and you realize it might all be connected. So also during the same time period, I had a past life memory, but I thought that it was literally a normal memory. So it was when I started reading about the paranormal and other associated phenomena that I realized that this weird out of place, out of time memory, is obviously not from this lifetime. But I thought that when I was around 3, 4 years old, that I was riding in a covered wagon with my grandmother in this old-timey prairie dress, 2 long braids, And we pull up to this old country store, and I are arguing because she wants me to go into the country store and ask the very old-timey man behind the counter for a pound of butter. And I had this attitude that I absolutely had in this lifetime as a little kid. And I'm like, I am not going in there. I do not want to ask that man for a pound of butter. And we're arguing, and I eventually lose the argument. I have to go in. And I mean, this is like stuff out of like, Little House on the Prairie. But I thought that it was all part of a normal memory that I had. But it was when I was, started researching the paranormal, I was like, oh, that did not happen in this lifetime. I have never ridden in a covered wagon. But the snippet of this memory is so crystal clear that I have never doubted that it was absolutely me and my grandmother. My grandmother from this lifetime was that grandmother. So, I'm uncovering all of this at the age of 16, and I'm losing my mind, right? I'm just like, I want to tell the world, like, did you know that there are UFOs and you might have a past life and you can get floated out of your window? And there's, all of it was just really tough to digest as a teenager, and no one believed me, right? And not that I was telling everyone all these other snippets and pieces of things I was remembering, but no one believed that I'd seen a UFO. So then I'm also remembering that I had what some people called an imaginary friend, but I do not believe that she was an imaginary friend. So this is also probably between the ages of 3 and 4. I remember her name was Amia. I remember that she only existed in my backyard. She never came in the house, and she seemed to be connected to the land. She looked like a very stereotypical depiction of a Native American woman from an earlier time period. She wore animal skins. She had long black hair in 2 braids. But the weird part is she did not have a face. It was just an empty blank spot. So you would think that that would be terrifying, but it wasn't terrifying to me at all. She was extremely comforting. Anytime I went outside, she was there waiting for me. She swung on the swing set with me. She didn't have a mouth, so we didn't talk verbally, but there were constant downloads between us. An understanding. My family talked about her because I talked about her all the time, but of course they just thought it was a cute imaginary friend. But I would say that my understanding of nature and my deep relationship with nature and my spiritual practices started there, because she communicated to me that I needed to learn how to take care of nature, that animals were sacred, that we were related to animals, and to show to my grandfather. She taught me how to speak to a toad, which sounds so silly, but she, I remember we were by a tree at the very back of our incredibly large backyard. We had a really large urban lot, and the back of it was wooded. It was like my sanctuary, and I was out there all the time. She squatted down next to me, next to a tree, and she called this little toad over, and it hopped over, and she was just, I don't remember all the details. This was so long ago, and it just wasn't in normal linear communication. But she basically said, this is how you do it. And so I told my grandfather, who babysat me for the most part. He was a disabled veteran, so he was home with me. I said, you should come outside and I could show you that I can call this little toad over. I called it a frog, though. I didn't know the difference. And I think he thought that that was pretty hilarious and cute. And so he comes outside with me. I take him to this tree because it had to be done at the tree. And he squats down, and I'm like, just wait. Friend frog is coming. And sure enough, this little frog hops up and just hangs with us. And my grandfather was like, huh, okay. How'd you learn to do this? And I was like, well, of course, Amia told me how to do this. And so every day I couldn't tell you how long. It could have been days. It could have been a few weeks. I went to the tree and I waited, called, quote unquote, called my little friend to me. And, just kind of started developing this really interesting magical relationship with nature. There was one day that I went out and frog never showed up. And maybe frog had died, because frogs don't, toads don't have a long lifespan, probably. So it did end at some point. But that is really the moment where I started playing around with what I would call magic now. I didn't know that's what it was called. But so all of this, is happening around the same time period. Maybe I should tell you a little bit about the house that I lived in. So I lived in a house that my mother had been raised in. My mother had two way older brothers. One was like 9 years older than her, one was 7 years older than her. My grandfather, who helped raise me, was a fourth Cherokee. I don't think that I have any indigenous blood in me, though, because I think that there may have been some infidelity on my grandmother's part when my mother was born. That's a whole other story. But I was raised with an extremely religious, conservative, mentally ill grandmother. My part Cherokee grandfather, who had a very interesting mix of spirituality and practices, who had been a prisoner of war in Korea for 3 years and then was a baby or, young. They moved into this house. And so my family and I often would gather and talk about the creepiness of the house. The house had 3 levels to it, or two. No, it had 2 levels to it. So it had a really large finished basement that was partly subterranean, that had recessed windows, and then it had a very large upper story. And my grandfather and my grandmother never slept in the same room, because when he came back, when he was freed from being a prisoner of war in Korea, he spent a year in Japan. He came back. This is before we had a name for post-traumatic stress disorder. Of course, they called it shell shock, but he was greatly traumatized. He'd been tortured for 3 years, and he had really violent night terrors. So he and my grandmother did not sleep even in the same part of the house. So he had his own little, like, almost apartment in this finished basement. My grandmother and everyone else is on the top part of the floor. My mom was very unstable, so she lived with us in this house part of the time, and then other times she would live with her boyfriend. But this house was very interesting. It was built in the 50s, so it wasn't super old, but there was just something about it. You could feel it the second you walked in. So before I was born, when my mom was a kid, my grandmother and grandfather and both of her older brothers had tons of stories about hearing people, unseen people walking up and down the stairs from the basement up to the top level. My grandfather frequently felt an unseen ghost cat jump up on his chest when he slept in the basement. He said it happens almost nightly, and it didn't even scare him. It was just the ghost cat that he shared a room with. My uncles frequently talked about seeing people kind of out of their periphery vision walking around the corner in the basement. So a lot of it was centered in the basement, which is also one of the windows that I was having dreams about being pulled out of. The house was weird. The garage door would open and close by itself. It was just a weird place. And even though I never saw a ghost or an apparition or even an orb or anything like that, I did, as I was a child, would find myself feeling like there was a presence there, and I would speak out loud to it because it would scare me so much. I'd be scared to, like, walk into a dark room. So I would be like, I know you're in there, but I'm not scared of you. And I'd have to, like, psych myself up. So the house had a presence. So I mentioned that it was a really large yard, and the very back of it was wooded. My grandmother would talk frequently about seeing weird disembodied lights out there in the woods. So a very odd place, full of stories, spirits, and witnessed by everyone in different ways. But the funny thing is none of my family would say they believed in ghosts or spirits or anything like that. It was very odd, and it really puzzled me as a kid. But I think as I've gotten older, it's because of their conservative Christian ideologies. In that form of Christianity, ghosts weren't real. They couldn't be, right? So in one breath, they would say, yeah, I heard footsteps or saw a strange apparition, but I don't really believe in ghosts. So it really didn't make sense to me. And it really made the history and the feeling of the house and the things that were going on even more unclear to me. And it made me think, well, none of these quote unquote dreams could be real. None of this can be real because my family doesn't believe in it, right? So it was confusing for me as a kid, experiencing and witnessing a lot of odd things. So I began my 12th grade year in this mental state. you can even imagine, of having seen this UFO over the summer between my 11th and 12th grade year, I read everything I could get my hands on. I'm talking like stuff about the Roswell incident. I was reading John Mack's writing, Bud Hopkins. There wasn't quite as much literature out there as there is now. I mean, I'm just so impressed with everything and everybody that's came forward at this point in time. But I think a common theme that you hear from experiencers is once you start down that rabbit hole, you start to read about cryptids and Sasquatch and the Fae, and demons. And so by the time I started 12th grade, I had this ridiculous amount of knowledge that I didn't know what to do with. And then I wanted to tell everybody. I felt like I knew something that nobody else knew. I also started reading about a ton of different government conspiracies because all of that kind of intersects. So I was a mess, and I think I was miserable to be around. If you walked past me in the hallway my senior year of high school, you would absolutely see some tattered book in my hand about one of those subjects. And I was like proselytizing to everyone that, UFOs are real, the government conspiracies are real. I was not sleeping. It was a tough time. Oh, and I'm so sorry. I forgot to mention that during that time period of right after seeing the UFO, it probably was like, I don't know, a week afterwards. One morning I woke up and I had two triangle shaped chunks cut out of both of my thumbs on the exact same spot. So, I mean, I'm not going to say what that was. That could have been something I manifested from my deep paranoia, but it is a little weird. So I was convinced that maybe they had put an implant in both of my thumbs. So that didn't at school. Everybody called me X-Files girl, which was not unwarranted. And the only person who would entertain any of this was my physics teacher. Because, if you look at quantum physics and a lot of different theories of physics, some of this stuff is absolutely possible. I mean, completely possible, right? And so he was the only one who would let me talk about this stuff. And unfortunately, I felt too comfortable in talking about it in front of the entire class. And it was a rough time. So, yeah. So, I mean, it took a while for me to mature in such a way that I understood that there was no reason to constantly talk about it. So I guess I'm about to head into some things that started to happen in my 20s where some really interesting kind of psychic stuff picked up. But do you have any questions before I head there?
Yes, I do. Yes. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Okay. So back to 1999, right? You already felt a connection, obviously. And speaking about the Santa stuff, which I have questions about that too. But speaking about Santa and all this stuff coming to visit you, the not Santa, essentially. But you already felt a connection once you see this orb, and you weren't scared at all. In fact, you were excitedly like, oh, they're here. And you're trying to explain to your boyfriend, and, they're like, you're like going, look, there they are. They're here to visit me. And then when the black helicopter comes along, you mentioned in the email that you were like flipping it off, like, I know why you're here, like kind of sticking up for them, like telling them to go away versus essentially what we should assume really the orb and whatever that was attached to, you probably should have been scared of, considering what at that point, of course, you hadn't, it sounds like, really remembered much of at that very moment, right? But really, you should have been scared of seeing that.
It's a weird combination of being excited and feeling like I knew them. And then but my conscious brain saying, this is not possible. You should be scared.
Right.
So it was a weird combination, and it's really hard to even put into words.
The other thing about that encounter is the fact that you said, it was like this normal, nice, sunny day. And then all of a sudden it's like the heavens, as they say, the heavens opened up and the clouds moved in and it poured. That reminds me a lot of what David Pilates talks about in the Missing 411. When they figure out someone is missing, then essentially weather moves in and just makes it impossible to search as easily for these missing people or children. That was something that stuck out to me. And not that I'm assuming that's, connected or anything. It was just a point that I wanted to at least mention because
that's very interesting.
Yeah. So, also, Santa Claus. Let's talk about old Santa Claus. So
Ugh.
they are encouraging you, rightfully so, because by God, who wants to see? And of course, as you rightfully mentioned, the cover of Whitley Strieber's Communion has been almost damn near a gateway drug for some people, and it's been a very shocking one.
Yep.
You always complied with not opening your eyes to not see Santa Claus, or did you, in fact, at any point see anything that looked like Santa Claus, like your version of a Santa Claus?
No, I know that I never opened my eyes. I followed the instructions that this unseen voice was telling me to do.
And I
Like,
know
I didn't want to see it.
I don't blame you. I don't blame you a damn bit. I know later on we have an occurrence where you felt essentially hands, for lack of a better term, on you. Did you, these early memories, do you recall being lifted or touched or grabbed in any way, shape, or form to go out these 3 different windows at various times?
No, I know I felt like I was hovering, levitating above the bed, and I know that that window was not open. So so I knew that I was literally going through a physical object, but no, I don't remember any touch.
How big were the wounds? Were they on the pads of your thumbs or on the tops?
No, so if you just stick both of your thumbs up and put your other fingers in, they were on the side that would be facing you when you look at your thumbs.
And these triangles were situated in the exact same orientation on each thumb and the exact same size.
Yes.
Mm.
And they were not there when I went to bed that night, and I woke up the next morning and they weren't bloody, but they were open wounds.
And there was no blood on the sheets, anything like that?
No,
Mm.
nothing.
I knew you were going to say that. Okay. Santa Claus, going back again. Sorry, I'm kind of all over the place. Santa Claus is visiting you. And even though you don't see him, you believe that's Santa Claus. I know you say you didn't tell your family, but you were the eldest of 3 sisters. Did you ever say, hey, sissies, like, don't you guys have Santa Claus coming to visit you? Like, just in passing, like, even as a lighthearted thing. Did that ever come out of your mouth? Do you remember saying anything like that?
No, and that's what is so confusing to me about my lifetime of experiences is I really compartmentalized everything. And I think that it was probably a coping mechanism. It was how my conscious everyday Heather brain and body could handle all of this.
I completely understand that. Absolutely. Okay, Mr. Toad, how would you call this toad over? Was it more just this mental willing of this creature? Okay, so you would sit down and just kind of in your mind be like, I'm here, like, come check me out, come hang out.
Yeah. And it's a sweet memory. It was really sweet.
Yeah, that's a cool little addition to this. And that's something that ties right back into what I said in the very beginning about some of you guys just have the shine to you. And what came first, the chicken or the egg? Were you given that shine, or did you already have the shine and that's why you have all these different things going down around you,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. But I'm glad that I was able to show that to my grandfather multiple times. So it's not, because sometimes you question yourselves with these types of things, but that, somebody else saw it, commented on it, and actually witnessed it with me,
Yes.
So I do appreciate that.
Last, zipping back, sorry. The 1999 orb. Now, I know the dogs reacted in a very strong way to this orb, which we've heard before, right? Do you think if you had gotten, sorry, it was your boyfriend and who else was outside with you?
Just a male friend.
Okay. So do you think if you had time, or they had whipped their heads around or looked in that direction in time before it went behind the barn, do you think they actually would have been able to see that? Or do you think that was just meant for you? And of course the dog saw it too. I realize that. But do you think that was just meant for you?
I used to not think that. I used to be incredibly angry and frustrated that they had not seen it. because it would have lent more credibility. But now I do think it was just for me because it led me on this path of discovery that I was absolute, and it woke me up to the things that had been happening to me my entire life. It was just time. I almost equate it to uh an otherworldly visitor like flicking me on the head, like, wake up,
Right.
this, you've been having this stuff all along, wake up.
And this isn't the first time that it's essentially happened that way, where it's essentially a UFO. It's an unidentified flying object. Like you said, I didn't see a craft. It was more of an orb. Doesn't matter. It's still a UFO. That is the awakening moment. That is the moment where you become essentially highly conscious of what is going on and what has gone on since you were a child. And look at all these other things that have gone on since. Now, when was the last time you recall being told, close your eyes, Santa Claus is here?
I mean, I probably was 4. And I think that it occurred multiple times between the ages of 2 and 4. I mean, it could have happened before the age of 2, but I have no memory of that.
Right. This has come up lots of times. I'm sure people would want me to at least bring it up. Have you ever considered going under some kind of hypnosis or regression? Is that something that interests you, or do you think, I remember enough, I think I'm all set with that?
No, I mean, I would be open to that. I actually used to have a friend who was certified in hypnosis, coming from a psychology and social work world. Definitely have friends who are licensed, counselors and social workers that do different modalities, but I don't know why it's not something that I've sought out. I think I'm a it's interesting. I'm a very spiritual person and an incredibly logical person. And I think sometimes my logical brain ends up winning too often. I'm just in these last few months trying to move a little back into the unsaid and spiritual realm. So maybe that's something I will eventually look into.
And again, not that that's the end all be all, just like somebody taking a lie detector test, it would be something similar to that. But I just wanted to bring that up. All right. Well, thank you so much for answering all those questions. You may continue.
Okay. 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 I do want to mention that around, 16, 17 years old, so I'm living with my grandmother and I got really into psychedelics, mushrooms, LSD. I'm not, advocating anything, but I do want to say that part of this experience led me in that direction. And, people have to do their own research, but are so many studies and anecdotal stories that are absolutely available and out there that having psychedelic experiences can also lead to increased paranormal and psychic experiences as well. So I do want to mention that was a part of my sometimes, weekend partying with friends. And so what kind of happened is, so my brain is blasted open with this whole UFO experience. I'm remembering all these things. I'm getting interested in psychedelics, which leads me to become really interested in meditation, which went from there to me living what I would have called maybe a modern hippie lifestyle for a while. So, and it's funny how a lot of times those things do tend to lead into each other. But so I'm deeply impressed by my own meditation practice that I had when I was 17 years old. I don't have anything like that now, but I was so interested in the brain and what I was uncovering and what kind of powers that we as humans have and the things that happen to us that we don't understand. So I got very deeply into a transcendental meditation experience. I started reading a lot about Buddhism, and I was also introduced to yoga. And when I say yoga, I don't mean the physical practice, although I do that now, but the actual philosophical path. So, yoga and Buddhism both lend themselves to all sorts of paranormal experiences, unlike some of our Abrahamic religions that we practice, in modern times. You're only supposed to believe very rigid things, and we ourselves don't have powers. It's all God, whereas these Eastern, mystical practices really say that we do have these powers. And so I got really interested in that. I am doing this daily meditation that I learned from a transcendental meditation book. So I just want you to kind of like, that's what I'm doing. I'm wearing tie-dyes. I'm sometimes doing psychedelics, and I'm meditating a lot. And so I'm 17 years old. I think it's at the end of my senior year, and I lived with my grandmother. She was out of town. So I woke up on a Saturday morning alone in the house, and I slept on a little twin bed, and I was fully awake, and I was about to get up out of bed. My eyes were open. I started to sit up, and all of a sudden this interesting feeling comes over me that was strangely very similar to the tranquilized, comforting feeling that would happen when I was pulled out of the window. And so what it did is it forced my eyes shut. It made me lay back down, but still fully conscious. But I couldn't move my body. I was not in control. And so when I laid back down, eyes forced shut, I feel very calm, tranquil, like I'm kind of floating in this like a womb-like state. And I start to what I think is physically rolling off the bed, but a twin bed is very narrow. So if you think about an adult-sized body rolling, like you probably roll maybe twice and then you're in the floor. Well, I rolled and rolled and rolled and rolled and rolled, and I did not hit the floor. And I was realizing as this was happening that something was weird. I wasn't able to open my eyes. I didn't quite know what was going on. It felt wonderful. Pretty sure I had a smile on my face. And so I didn't hit the ground. In fact, I levitated up. I did not realize it at the time, but I was having my first out of body experience. But it's all happening fast. I'm really enjoying it. I'm hoping that it lasts forever. But then all of a sudden, I physically feel hands grab both of my ankles hard, like with malice, and pull. And the way that it felt, I mean, this sounds dramatic, but it felt as if something was trying to pull my soul out of my body. It was horrifying. And all of a sudden, my eyes open, I'm laying in that twin bed, and I am soaked in sweat in a way that didn't seem possible. If that was just if it just lasted a few seconds, I shouldn't have been that sweaty. But it was a jarring experience. And I sat up, and I immediately felt like my bedroom was an unsafe place to be. I ran out of there, called my boyfriend, "You have to come pick me up. This house is unsafe." I was convinced that the visitors, the extraterrestrials, had came back to get me and were trying to pull me out of my body. I don't know to this day what that part of the experience was. I was definitely pulled back into my physical form very quickly, and it was very scary, but that was my first and not last out of body experience. So around that same time, maybe like a year and a half later, I have my first incident of a very serious precognitive dream. And so in the dream, my boyfriend that I'd had during the UFO sighting went on to, we had a child together at the age of 18. We got married at 19. So I ended up marrying my high school sweetheart. So we had a baby, and we were living in an apartment alone, and I was dreaming about his family. So his family, without going into too many details, there was a lot of opiate addiction in his family. His younger brother was having a really serious problem, and his younger brother was young in high school. And so in the dream, younger brother has his older sister up against the wall, holding a knife to her neck and screaming at her, "You better not tell dad." It was just a snippet of a moment, but it was deeply disturbing to me. I felt it very viscerally. And so when I woke up, I was very disturbed, very unsettled. So I was like, I need to call her, the older sister, and tell her what I just dreamed. And as I was reaching for the phone, which was a landline, this was in 2001, didn't have a cell phone. As I'm reaching for it, the phone rings. I pick it up. It's her. She's crying. And basically that exact same scene had just played out. And when I could have finished her sentences. Like I knew exactly what she was telling me and what had just happened. And instead of being a good, sister-in-law friend and being there for her, I was more interested in the fact that I had just dreamed it. And I was like, okay, but listen, I just dreamed that. So I wasn't, I didn't help the situation. When she repeated the story to me that I just dreamed, I had a full body response. I mean, like full adrenaline rush. And I have since that time had many incidences like this. So having precognitive dreams is nothing out of the ordinary for me. I've never had anything that negative though. Usually they're more mundane types of things where I'll dream a scene and I'll just see it play out the next day. I do worry that if I ever have a dream about death or like a plane crash, that I need to, that might be a message. I do pay attention to my dreams. I write a lot of them down. All the women in my family also have incidences of precognition in their dreams. So that's interesting, and I think what interests me about this is how the UFO incident just kind of started leading to all of these things. Also, this same time period. So between the times of, I would say, 18 to 22, a lot happened to me. Most of everything that I'm going to talk to you about happened during that time period. And I do think it is related to using psychedelics and to the meditation practice and just to age, that youthfulness, that openness, that neuroplasticity. I think as we get older and the world constantly tells us that, none of this is real. None of this can happen. Oh, and pay your mortgage, make sure you work 9 to 5. Like some of that stuff, it's just harder to access. So this same time period, right after this precognitive dream, I'm still having my daily meditation practice. I'm getting into yogic philosophy. I'm trying to be really disciplined about my practices. I had 3 dreams that I can only call, and I don't know if this is even a word or a term, hypnagogic telekinesis. The hypnagogic state is a very interesting state that neuroscience finds interesting. Even looking at trying to research the paranormal, a lot of things happen during that between state between fully awake and asleep. And that's also when sleep paralysis occurs. So it's a very interesting time. And it was definitely a very interesting time for me during this time period. So to explain, so the first one, they seem mundane, but they're really not. So the first one, I'm dreaming and I myself am walking towards myself in the dream. So it's a completely black background. I'm seeing out of my, eyes in first person like I would, and myself is walking up towards me with this kind of smile on my face. And I just go to, like, if you were going to hard shove someone, how you thrust your hands out. So in the dream, the other version of me thrusts her hands out towards me. And as that causes me to wake up, and as I wake up, every bottle in my shower falls over. And how do I know that? I mean, I didn't at the moment. I heard this horrible loud crash as my eyes are opening, as this dream person is shoving, and I knew it was from the bathroom. So I immediately got up and walked in there and looked. I mean, that's not normal, all the bottles were scattered all in different places. They weren't teetering next to each other, almost about to fall over. It never happened before. It never happened again. So I do believe that the psychic energy of that dream and that shoving action literally caused all of the shampoo and body wash and just every bottle in the shower to fall over. Completely freaked me out. Excuse me. Because I did know intuitively that it was connected. I was like, I kind of think that I did that. Don't know. I can't prove it, but that was really weird. In that exact same time period, 2 more things happened very similarly. And I don't know if they were days apart, weeks apart, or maybe even a couple months apart. But, I'm still doing this daily meditation practice. I had a second out of body experience during that same time period that was much more peaceful. I didn't feel like I was being yanked back into my body by unseen forces. And when the second one started, I knew what it was because it started just like the first one. And also pointing out that both out of body experiences were also right after waking up in the morning. So again, just coming out of the hypnagogic, brainwave state. So and it really isn't like a super interesting story. I was I got up out of my body and my body was still in bed and I was not, and so that happened twice. Then I have this dream where all the bottles fall over. And then I had 2 back-to-back dreams very similar to that first one where it's a completely black background. I'm in my body looking through my eyes, and a person is walking towards me, and they grab a door handle and just open a door. So like, nothing super interesting, but as it happens both times in both the dreams, my eyes wake up and my closet door flies open with force. So after that second and third time, I was like, okay, this is me. This is my psychic energy making this happen. And that it's interesting. I wish that I would have told someone who maybe was a scientist during that time, and we could have done some sleep studies or somehow, investigated this, because I think it's fascinating now. And if somebody told me this story, I would be like, you powerful and amazing. That's so cool. But it terrified me because I'm not, too far away from having this UFO experience. I've started to remember all of these things. I'm meditating, and now my brain feels completely too powerful and out of control. So I stopped my meditation practice and did not pick it back up until my 30s, because I felt like I did not know what I could make happen, and it did not feel safe. And I'd also had 2 out of body experiences, and I started reading a lot of out of body experience literature, and there's a lot of, unfortunately, scary stories in there of people wondering if people who die in their sleep are just, out of body travelers who can't make it back to their body. So I just felt like this was out of control, and I let a very strict and beautiful meditation practice go for decades, unfortunately. But I think that might, illustrate just how powerful it was and that brain state was for me. So, that happened. I'm pretty freaked out. I am taking notes of everything. I'm a writer, and I have always kept a journal since I was in elementary school. And I still have my journal from this time period. And it shifts from being a very normal, like 19, 20-year-old journal to only being a paranormal journal because so many things were happening. So many synchronicities were happening, and I was documenting all of it. So it's just funny watching it completely change and shift. So I quit meditating. I'm hoping that this stuff will just stop because I just felt out of control, and I had no support. I was not telling anyone about any of this, only writing it in my journal. And thankfully, I was reading a lot of literature. I can't even think of any of the names of people. I don't know if Shannon, the book, The Holographic Universe. Are you familiar with that?
People have brought that up before. Yeah.
Okay. So I was reading a lot of stuff in that vein. There was a researcher with the last name Taggart. I can't remember his first name, who were legitimate researchers, looking at different theories of physics, trying to understand near death and out of body experiences. So I was seeing that it wasn't just me having this. I just didn't have anyone in rural Arkansas in the early 2000s to talk to about any of this. So all of that occurs. And then I did have one weird incident, of a shared incident, thankfully. So I can, I have corroboration. One of my best friends at the time, we were probably 20, and her mother passed away from pneumonia. Her mother had a drug addiction problem and had a compromised immune system, and died at a really young age. And she came over the day after her mother passed away, most likely looking for a good friend to lean on. And I remember we were sitting in the floor of my living room. We were facing each other, and she was very upset and just talking kind of a million miles an hour about how she couldn't believe it was real. I think she was having a hard time, accepting the reality that her mother was gone. And all of a sudden, while she's telling her story, we both hear a voice. And it's interesting because we both turned to look in the exact same direction. So I turned to my left, and she was facing me. So she turned to her right. And the voice came from right above our heads. It was an unintelligible voice that said 5 words that we could not understand or discern. And I don't think that the message was the point. I think that the fact that it happened was the point. And it really did not help my friend's mental state. It really freaked her out. I think maybe if she'd heard her mother's voice, it would have been comforting. But the fact that it was just this unintelligible, out of nowhere, out of place and time voice freaked her out. So we're still friends. We just recently saw each other. We don't live in the same state, but she came into town last year and she said, "Did that happen?" And I said, "Yes, that absolutely happened." But, after she heard the voice, she just was like, "I do not know what that was, but I have to go now." What I think all these years later, having lots of time to think about it, I mean, that's really the only time I've had an experience like that with another person right after someone has passed away, is that between the psychic energy I had surrounding me and her grief and the loss of someone and being in that liminal space when someone just passes away, is that we kind of broke open the time space continuum a little bit. I don't think that the voice had anything to do with us. It's almost just like the fabric of reality got torn open a little bit, and it was really freaky. But that's the only thing like that happened. So I think that would have been 2002. And so then after that, I was in college, I was an undergrad. I left my husband in 2003 and moved out on my own. I was a young single parent trying to get myself through college, studying psychology. I was really getting into Carl Jung, and archetype and symbolism and Joseph Campbell. All of that was deeply healing for me. I was trying to relate it to a lot of the experiences that I had. Still wasn't telling anybody about it, but it was starting to make a little more sense to me, and how things maybe are possible. But things were quiet in the realm of paranormal things for me for a long time. I'd stopped meditating, and I think I was just distracted. I was a young parent, a young college student, and just still reading about things, but nothing happened to me for a while. I would say the next thing that happened was in 2006. I was in my mid 20s and I was on a long road trip with someone I was dating at the time, and we drove from Arkansas out to Arizona. And this was my first time in that state. It was my first time in the American Southwest. But we wanted to visit the Grand Canyon as well as Sedona, Arizona, which, is cool places. But I didn't really know what to expect. But we planned on hiking into Havasu Canyon and camping on the Havasupai Reservation for 3 nights. If anybody is familiar with Havasu Canyon, it's one of the most photographed parts of the Grand Canyon. It has gorgeous turquoise blue waterfalls. As unfortunately very degraded and damaged at this point by tourism, but this is in mid 2000s. It wasn't quite as bad. I would say Instagram has probably done a lot of damage to this area and to the tribe that lives there and makes that part of the canyon their home. But the only way you can get to this reservation and this campground is either by donkey or by foot. There's no roads. You have to hike right into the canyon. I can't remember exactly how many miles it is, but we were ill prepared. I was not a hiker yet at this time. I had terrible hiking boots on. And we started at dusk because we were worried about the heat during the day, but we also had no business hiking the Grand Canyon in the middle of the night. But anyway, so we started dusk. We're hiking in. We were in kind of a narrow part of the canyon where, you see rock walls on both sides and you look straight up and you see a little bit of sky, but you see a lot of rock wall too. And it wasn't dark yet, and we look up and I say, "Do you see the little lights dancing around?" And certainly he did. And I would say for the first 2 or 3 miles of our hike into the canyon, we were followed by dancing spirits. I mean, that's the only thing I can tell you. They were absolutely not fireflies. They were interacting with each other. They were kind of dancing and moving around with each other. They were very small. They were only in this one part of the canyon above our heads, and it was really bizarre and beautiful to watch. So, I immediately felt that it was important and that it was paranormal. He was a more skeptical person and was just like, "Yeah, it's weird," didn't care much about it. But I mean, I've never forgotten it. And once I did a little research about this particular part of the canyon and the Havasupai people, I came to understand that that is a very regular occurrence. And they say that those are their ancestral spirits. And I think that that's wonderful and beautiful. And I'm very honored that I got to see something like that. And that kind of like, it'd been many years since I'd had anything happen. So that kind of like jolted me back awake. Like, oh, yes, there is magic in the world and it's all around me. So I'll fast forward a few years. So I ended up having another child and still a single parent. And I had contracted to have a house built. And so in 2009, myself and my two sons moved into a house. It was a really stressful time in my life. I was a social worker at this time, working full time, and trying to, single parent two young boys. And I had a lot of relationship issues and had a lot of growing up to do. So we're living in this new house, brand new, first person to live in it, right? So, I mentioned earlier that nighttime has always been a difficult time for me. And that is probably still true. I mean, I just think that nighttime is a vulnerable time. So, I had a hard time sleeping when we first moved into this house. And so, I guess how to explain it is I started having these weird, repetitive, reoccurring dreams. And in the dream, exact same thing would play out every time. So I would see kind of a disembodied wrist and hand knock really hard on the front door. I mean, if you think about like police knocking, right? Like bang, 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 bang. And it would jolt me awake because I could feel the pounding like in my chest, right? And the first several times it happened, I got up out of bed and I went and looked out the peephole in the door. No one there, right? And it's 2 a.m., 3 a.m. when this is happening. So after this happened several times in a row, I realized this is a dream. But it also felt important because it is the exact same scene playing out over and over again. And the first several times it happened, when I was jolted awake, I was in an absolute panic adrenaline rush, right? Like there's somebody trying to get in the house. Well, then I start to realize I think this has like a spiritual component to it. So calm down, but I still kept having it. And it wasn't every night, but it was probably 2 times a week for many months, and it would just jolt me awake, always, past midnight, but before 5 a.m. So I began dating someone, and we weren't together very long. It was a pretty casual relationship, but they were asleep in my bed one night, and I have the dream. And interestingly, I'm laying there awake. It's probably 2 or 3 a.m. Every time I had this dream, it took me a while to go back to sleep. And this guy who we really don't know each other that well, we're not super close, is talking in his sleep. And he says, "There's someone at the door." And it just made my skin crawl. I mean, he didn't wake up and he did not remember it the next day, but he was interacting with my dream. So, I'm getting really used to having this dream every week, whatever. I get to where I can go back to sleep a little bit quicker. And then one night, both my kids are asleep in my bed with me. And again, the dream happens. And my oldest, he would have been like 8. So I wake up from the dream and I look over at him and he's awake. And I say, "Hey, why are you awake?" And he says, "Mom, I think there's someone at the door." And I was just like, "No, not again." I was like, "I can promise you that there's no one at the door." And he's like, "How do you know?" "Because I heard something." And I was like, "Buddy, you just have to trust me. There's no one at the door." I mean, I didn't want to tell him, here in the middle of the night when I'm sure he's scared that I've been having this dream now for months and it's a weird disembodied wrist and hand that's beating on the door. And you don't have to worry. I look all the time and it's no one there. So that was really interesting, really odd situation. I think it was exacerbated by stress and just by being newly alone in this new house. I've never quite understood the message that was trying to come across in that dream, but it was powerful enough that my son and an acquaintance also both interacted with it. So then also, so okay, that was 2009. So 2011. 2011, something really interesting happens that is a little bit similar in terms of the brain state to what happened with my first out of body experience when I was 17. How I explained that I was fully awake, I sit up, and then something comes over me, my eyes are forced shut, I'm back in bed, and something occurs outside of my control. So something happened like that in 2011. I was about to get up in the morning and I'm forced back to lay down. And what is revealed to me is another past life memory. And it is very detailed, it's long, it's complicated, it's meandering. I'm not going to go into all of it. Basically, I was shown kind of living the life of this female entertainer. She was, I got this feeling like a burlesque dancer, singer, loved being in the spotlight. And she was married to a high ranking Nazi officer of some sort who was in charge of doing some things in a concentration camp. So I do have visions of being on this concentration camp. I don't know which one. In the snippets of visions, there was another language being spoken. I could not tell if it was German or Polish, but I definitely knew it was one of them. And there's little pieces that I knew about this woman that I knew that she herself did not believe in Nazi ideals. She was a feminist. She was very progressive for her time, but she also loved living a lavish lifestyle, which is what that man gave her. And so basically, I think the point of the image and the memory was that this woman had really failed in standing up for vulnerable peoples and social justice. And she paid for it. I got to see a lot of different snippets from her life, and then she passed away. And then I actually got to experience what it was like to be her in a hell-like state. And I'm not talking about a Christian version of hell. It's not Dante's Inferno hell. It was a very Buddhist idea of hell, which is that our mentality makes up our reality, which also makes up the afterlife. She hated herself for what she had been complicit in, and she lived in what felt like millennia of sadness. So basically, she was wandering around in this giant, heavy dress in a damp, dark castle where stairs led to nowhere, and it was in knee-deep water. And so she would just trudge around sad and shameful, carrying this heavy dress around and walking upstairs that led to nowhere and just couldn't get out. And then all of a sudden, this poet shows up and scoops her up out of the water and says, "What are you doing here? You have to get out of here. I don't know why you're hanging out here." And then takes her to this hallway, which I believe was like a purgatory-like state, and sits her down with a back against the wall and a line full of other lost souls. And we were taking turns getting ready to go into a room with a wise elder to discuss the bad decisions that we'd made in that last lifetime and to be reincarnated. I remember sitting next to another being and them asking me why I had committed the atrocities I had committed. And I remember saying, because I wanted to live. And then that was the end of the memory. And then I, was jolted awake, sat up in bed, like heart beating hard, finally back in control of myself. And I was just saying, thank you, thank you, thank you. I needed this because it showed me why I was who I was in this lifetime and how I had to pay off some karmic debts and why I was in the family that I chose to be in. I mean, it just answered so many questions, and it really halted a lot of dysfunctional patterns that I had, been a part of. So it was a beautiful, wild, crazy experience. But I think one of the most important things that I think is interesting to just the study of the paranormal is the brain state of, having something take over your mind and your body. I mean, it happened during my first out of body experience. It happened as this past life memory was revealed. And then it happened a third time, which was just 2 years ago, which I'll get to in a little bit because I live in a very haunted house right now. And who decides what is it? What entity, what spirit or energy is it that decides this is enough that I need to take over Heather's brain
shut her eyes, make her lay down, and make something happen to her completely outside of her control. Certainly heard it from other people telling their stories. So I know I'm not alone in this, and I feel much more brave about talking about it now, but it is really interesting. So that happened when I was 28. So again, as I moved away from being in my early 20s, many things have slowed down. I do have a meditation and a really regular yoga practice now. I even became a yoga instructor, but it all hits different. I don't have this out of control psychic energy that I used to have. I actually, while I was in graduate school, experienced depression for the first time. And while I was depressed, I actually lost what I felt like complete contact with spirit. It was the most uncomfortable, scary, and bizarre feeling I've ever experienced in my life. I quit remembering all of my dreams. I quit having synchronicities. And I started reading other people's stories of depression. And a lot of people who experience depression on a regular basis, I've noticed that they talk about feeling like they're in a battle for their soul. And I literally felt like I was fighting a psychic battle for my spiritual well-being. Thankfully, I am not depressed anymore, but it took me to some really dark places. And that, I have a therapist, and I tell my therapist, I feel like spirit had cut me off and nothing was worth living for anymore, because if we're not connected to spirit, then what are we doing? And thankfully, I remember the day I had a crazy synchronicity happen, and I was like, oh, I'm back online. And I feel much better now. And I don't begin to understand exactly what that is and what that means. But, it's just kind of another interesting component to the story. So now, I'm 42 years old tomorrow. Tomorrow's my birthday. So I am in a very different place in understanding of these things. And I think that my experiences from infancy forward, combined with my understanding of science and my scientific inquiry and my, the jobs that I've held, and, my understanding of environmental science and of nature, and my spiritual practices now are all this beautiful story that are perfectly integrated, whereas they used to be compartmentalized and hard to digest. I definitely feel a lot more comfortable talking to people, and even other scientists who are very materialist. And I'm like, well, okay, if you think that I'm credible and you think that I'm smart, then listen to this, because this is not all that's out there. There's stuff we don't understand. So that kind of leads me to now. So I do live in a house that is full of activity. But I'll tell you one interesting thing that just occurred. I guess it's been a few months ago now, but I was headed out to a work site. So I did a job last year where I was doing a lot of hands-on field work in environmental restoration. And I was headed out to a work site. I drove a really giant work truck that I had no business driving, operated a lot of heavy machinery. And I had a work phone. So I had my regular cell phone and I had a work phone. And I hated carrying this work phone around. It was an iPhone. No offense, iPhone users, but I'm an Android person. I did not even know how to use it. I had no saved numbers in it, and I never used it. I had to carry it with me to work sites, but no one even called me on it. And when I would talk to, community members or other organizations that we were teamed up with, I always gave them my personal cell phone number. I didn't even know the number of this work phone. I would have to look it up. So I'm just trying to say I never used this thing. And I was in this giant work truck driving to this work site, and I have my cell phone out because I'm using GPS, so the map is on, and then I have this silly work phone in my purse. It decided to call my son, which is crazy because I hate to admit this, but I don't even have my son's cell phone number memorized because we have everything on speed dial, right? We don't even know phone numbers or addresses anymore half the time. So it called him, and then he immediately called it back, and I answer it, and I'm like, "Hi, this is Heather." And he's like, "Why did you call me?" And I was like, "What are you talking about? This is my work phone. I don't even know your phone number. What are you talking about?" And it's 8 a.m. My son typically isn't even awake at 8 a.m. And he's like, "No, this phone number just called me. Look at it." And so sure enough, I look at it, and this phone sitting in my purse called my son. So, this is not too long after I came out of this depressive state. So I was like, okay, spirit is back. Weird psychic energy is back. Welcome. Even though it's unsettling and odd. It's like, when I know these things are happening, like things are going the right way. So that happened. That's been the most recent interesting kind of like out of control psychic energy thing that's happened. But I want to tell you about my house because my house is ongoing. So I live with my husband, my 16-year-old son, and then I have a 23-year-old son who has a basement apartment, and then he has a 4-year-old daughter. So I'm a very young grandparent. But anyway, all of us are in this house. My 23-year-old son's partner also used to live here, but they're no longer together. So when we first moved in this house in February of 2022, so we've been here for 2.5 years, we all were here. And my granddaughter was almost 2. So she was very young when we moved in. So, as a practicing pagan, I believe that no matter what, when you move into a new space, whether it's a house, a new workspace, I really believe that you should put intention into clearing out old energy. And that's something that I do for myself and my family, but I also do it for other people. So that is one thing that I kind of offer other people is house cleansings. And I don't even necessarily think you need to do that for paranormal or unseen energies, but you should do that simply for some stagnant energy that's kind of hanging around from people that just left, because energy is real. I mean, it affects you. People's, if they're having fights or they're in an unhappy relationship, I think that stuff really does stick around. So we knew before we moved into this house that I had to do a cleansing ritual because the plan was to deeply gut it and do a lot of renovations. I didn't let my husband start on any of that until I did a full cleansing. And what that usually entails for me is writing out something that I speak to the space. I introduce myself. This is who we are. These are our intentions. I'm clearing out all old energies and welcoming us into this house, and also introducing ourselves to any spirits of the land or spirits lingering. So I did that. Standard practice, right? And he starts the renovations, and nothing happened during the renovations. He did most of those by himself. I was mostly at work, so he took like 2 weeks off work to do that. He didn't report anything happening. Tell you a little bit about my house and my neighborhood. My house was built in 1951, so it's not that old. It has 3 levels. It has a fully finished basement, which is like a separate apartment, a main level, and then we have a loft bedroom. And so my son and his girlfriend and the baby were in the basement. My 16-year-old was on the middle level. And then my husband and I and our 2 dogs, we also have 2 dogs, husband and I are in the loft bedroom. So our neighborhood, I live in Portland, Oregon, and Portland is has a really interesting history. And our particular neighborhood was not annexed into the city for a while. And it was all farmland owned by a Japanese family. So something interesting to know about the history of the West Coast, California, Washington, Oregon, after Lewis and Clark came and indigenous Americans were displaced, we had the gold rush, right? And we had a lot of Chinese and Japanese migrants come and literally built these cities in this area up. We're right on, we're near the ocean. We're right on 2 major rivers that were major shipping ports. So Portland, literally a port, was built by Japanese and Chinese families. And then when they were done doing all the work, the United States forcibly removed them from the country, which is devastating. So my neighborhood was owned by a wealthy Japanese farming family until the exclusion laws went into effect, and then the land was taken from them. So where I live has had 2 violent removals, the Chinook tribe forcibly removed, and then the Japanese family. So I knew that, there's a lot of Japanese influence in our neighborhood. You can tell by a lot of the plants that, they're put here that, traditionally Japanese people enjoyed, including a lot of different varieties of Japanese maples. But we also have a Shinto church down the street, which is not something that you see frequently. So there's definitely Japanese influence in our neighborhood. So anyway, back to the house. So we get moved in, we've done the renovations. I have 0 bad or weird vibes about this house, which is of course something that I had to seek every single house we went into. It was like, how does this house feel? We definitely toured a very haunted house. And so of course that was like, absolutely not. So we get moved in. And my son and his girlfriend and the baby are in the basement. And my son is a very skeptical person, very open, but he's like very logical. He wants to see facts. He wants to, research everything. And he's heard a lot of my stories, but, I think he's just like, maybe some of it's true. Probably a lot of it's not, Mom, whatever. But he began for the first time in his life having incidences of sleep paralysis in the basement. So the basement has a living area and a separate bedroom. So they were, of course, sleeping in the bedroom. He said that it felt so heavy and scary in that bedroom that he had to start sleeping on the couch in the living area. But the incidences of sleep paralysis absolutely followed him onto the couch. And he said they were so intense that he would, eyes open, bodies paralyzed, but he would know that there was an evil entity standing behind him. Like he could feel it almost breathing on him. It was tangible. And then he would, eventually wake himself up, but he was not sleeping well. And then during this same few weeks of this occurring, I mean, we'd probably lived in the house literally 2 weeks at this point. His little daughter, who's not even 2 yet, starts sleepwalking. And she had never done this before and has never done this since. But she would get up out of that bedroom, eyes fully open, following something up the stairs, which is absolutely dangerous, also terrifying because it's happening in the middle of the night, 2, 3 a.m., right after he's having sleep paralysis. So he feels, even as a skeptical person, it's absolutely connected. And I think it happened twice with the sleepwalking where she would get up, he would say her name, he would follow her up the stairs, and then she'd get to the top of the stairs, which puts you in our kitchen, and she would just stand there, eyes open, staring up. So how terrifying is that? So he tells me, it's 2 or 3 weeks into living there. He's like, Mom, there is something not right in this basement. I feel unsafe for our daughter. He tells me what's going on. So I'm kind of digesting it like, oh, okay, well, obviously my house cleansing did not work. We need to go a little deeper here. But also during that same week, I had printed out some photos. I know people don't print out photos as often as they used to because everything's digital these days, but I am very much an analog person in a lot of ways. So I, ordered a bunch of family photos to be printed at Walgreens. I went and got them. If anybody remembers getting photos printed, they put it in a little paper pouch. And so I brought that home and there was this really cute picture of my granddaughter in there. And that same day that he told me about that photo went missing. And nobody else in the house knew I'd even had photos printed. So I know that nobody stole this photo. And I mean, I have searched this house up and down. That photo was nowhere to be found. And it was there 1 minute and gone the next. So I feel intuitively, and my son feels, that photo going missing, the sleep paralysis, and her sleepwalking was all very connected. Also, during that same time, while she was awake down there during the day hanging out with her parents, she was waving at something unseen and smiling at it. So very creepy. My son was very unsettled with that. He and his girlfriend were like, Heather, we need your help. There's something in the basement. It's unsafe. Our daughter, is sleepwalking. This is not okay. So I jumped into high gear. I was like, okay, well, obviously I need to go a little deeper in my communicating with this house and the spirits of this land. And so I called over some of my witchy friends and we did a circle and we did a lot more. And I said a lot more. So I did a lot of research on this incident with Japanese, exclusion laws and the Japanese family. And I was like, I think maybe, and just intuitively feeling into it, that this could be connected. So I spoke very specifically to that atrocity and to that loss and to that, theft of the land. And I just said, I can't do anything about the past, but I can promise you that I will be the best steward of this land that I can be. I'm a big gardener. Like we've turned our land into a sanctuary. It's called Sacred Moon Sanctuary. And we grow a ton of food. We grow lots of flowers and we have our land open for yoga classes and for people to host events. And so, and it really is in the spirit of openness and sharing and community building and spirituality, really. And so in the Shinto faith, as I said, there's a Shinto church down the street. They speak of tree spirits and nature spirits called yokai. And so I thought it could be interesting and a little experimental to make, a little offering to the yokai. And so I have a beautiful giant sequoia in my backyard and I made a beautiful bouquet and I put it at the base of this sequoia. So we bought our house in February. So we're doing this ritual in probably April. And if anybody knows the Pacific Northwest, April is gross. It's wet. It's soggy. It's foggy. It's cold. It still feels like winter a little bit. And you would have thought that those flowers would have wilted, but they did not. They sat there for weeks. And I finally just went and got them and brought them back in and put them in the compost because they never wilted. So I think that that's something interesting and witnessed by other people. My husband noticed that too. So thankfully, that did stop the scary stuff surrounding the baby. That never happened again. She never slept walk again. And it also stopped the sleep paralysis of my son in the basement. But it has not stopped, activity in the house, which is fine because I don't necessarily need that or even believe it's possible to do that because I believe that we are surrounded by multiple universes and dimensions and unseen forces and spirits at all times. I think if we could lift the veil, that things would be busy around us that we don't realize that's what's going on. And so that is, to me, that's what reality actually is. And I think it's explainable by science and by physics. We're just not there yet. What I think is that we have a portal in our basement because what I think that we've witnessed are several different types of things. Some of them more malicious than others. Most of it's pretty harmless though. But so for instance, my husband, when we first met, was a atheist materialist. He is no longer that. He spent enough time around me that he can't be. And he's also witnessed things in our house now at this point. So he has heard weird sounds, multiple times. My 16-year-old son has heard what we think is mimicking. Something is calling his name in my voice, and it's absolutely not me. My older son has also had that happen multiple times. I have had what I think are my kids calling my name when they're not. And it's actually happened when they're sitting not far from me. And I'm like, did you just say my name? No. And they didn't hear it. So it's just, it's only geared towards me. I'm hearing it. Both of my sons and I have heard sets of 3 knocks on our front door now multiple times. And I know that that's not necessarily a good thing. So we definitely don't open the door when that happens because then you're letting something in, right? We do have one of those doorbells that have the camera on them so we can always see what's happening at our front porch. And when that happens, there's obviously nothing there. That's happened many times. I have heard what sounds like almost another family, like functioning in the house, like normal everyday sounds in the kitchen that are not being made by anyone. It almost sounds like someone's in there cooking, and it's just kind of a light commotion and then it passes quickly. One of the weirdest things that's happened, and I sent you a photo of, is that we had a T-shirt materialize in the basement, and it's beyond my husband or I's understanding, or we just think it's funny. But basically, I ordered my husband a T-shirt through an online order from a company out of San Francisco that makes these really cute graphic T-shirts. And it's just a bunch of garden vegetables, black T-shirt with colorful vegetables. Ordered it for him. It came in the mail. I opened the package. I handed it to him. Whatever. No big deal. And then he loves it, wears it a lot. He goes out of town for work, takes his T-shirt. And while he is out of town, I walk down to the basement and that T-shirt is sitting folded on a table in the basement. And I was just like, what? I swear he took it with him, right? And so when he gets back from his work trip, he pulls his laundry out and sure enough, there's the vegetable T-shirt. And I was like, wait a second. No, come down here. Right. And we go down to the basement and I was like, this is here. And I pull it up. I mean, it is the exact same T-shirt, black T-shirt with colorful vegetables. We are 100% certain that I did not order to and that we did not receive to. And I also think it's very interesting it showed up in the basement because that's where a lot of the stuff is centered around. So that was really interesting. And then a pretty major incident that was the 3rd incident of my body being taken over first thing upon awakening happened probably about 2 years ago. So it wasn't too long into living in this house. And I was in my loft bedroom alone. My husband was already awake and downstairs. I sit up, I'm about to get out of bed, and that familiar feeling comes over. My eyes are forced shut. I lay back down, and I must have put the covers up or over my head because what occurs then is I'm laying on my right cheek. So I'm laying on my right side. I have the covers up around my face. And over my head, I hear a male voice say, okay, you can go now. And then a little mischievous, what I would assume is like a fairy or gnome sized being, crawls out of, a split in the fabric of reality and runs up and down my body. I mean, I was fully conscious, not in control of my body, obviously, and I couldn't see because the covers were covering up the side of my face, but I felt it running all up and down the length of my body. I could feel 2 little feet. I could hear the covers pressing down around my ears. And it felt mischievous. It did not feel malicious. It was goofy. I was, unable to really process it in real time because it all did happen really fast. And then it jumped off the bed, and it jumped off in made a sound that I can only describe as if you put a fairy voice through an auto tuner, like a stereotypical fairy voice. It was shrieking, high pitched, really wild, and yet also electronic all at the same time. And it just faded out. And then once it faded out and the sound was over, I was in control of my body again. And I was just like, what just happened? And of course, I run down the stairs. I tell my family, they're just like, whatever. I mean, because that one, it's been a long time since something like that's happened to me. And it's a pretty wild story. I mean, you guys, the house is haunted. I think we have gnomes in the bedroom. And then I guess the last thing I'll mention, one of the last things that happened was I was sitting on my bed with my dog, a little Jack Russell Terrier named Luna. And it sounded as if my dresser was being pulled across the floor right in front of me. I could hear it. You know what that sounds like, of course. And she heard it. We both looked at the dresser. The dresser's not moving. It's obviously not happening. And I was just like, okay, of course, it's always something. And then that night we go to bed, our dogs sleep in our room with us, and she wakes me up. I don't know what time it was. It was in the middle of the night. We'd all been asleep, and she is sitting in the floor staring at a spot on the wall. And she doesn't do stuff like that. So that kind of sums up the stories about the house. I absolutely anticipate to have many more experiences. We'll probably live here for many years, but that's kind of where everything stands right now. So Shannon, I would love to hear any questions you might have.
I had it jotted down. I was hoping you'd go back to the gnome, because if you weren't going there, I was like, I got to hear about this gnome, because that is such it just stands out so differently from a lot of your other experiences in a way, right? I mean, some people might say, oh, well, it's the quote unquote aliens back again, or Santa, whatever you want to term them as. But that one just seems so unique, especially since there's an auditory element to it as well.
Right.
And for everybody, just really quick, if Heather sounds different, it's because she is so rolling with the punches today, because they're in Portland. They're having power outages. So she's now on her phone versus her computer for the first 3/4 of this chat. That's where she was talking to me from. So thanks again, Heather, for rolling with that.
Yeah.
Okay. Can we talk a little bit about the crackling noises that occur when you are experiencing your out-of-body experiences?
Oh, yeah. So it sounds like cellophane. If you were crackling cellophane right at your ear. It occurred both times when I had an out-of-body experience, and I've also read about it in the out-of-body experience literature. Other people discuss it. I don't know what it means, but I assume it is a common thing that happens when your light body or your subtle body is being pulled out of your physical form.
I have something to pose to you about the whole hands yanking you incident during one of your OBE experiences, because and I know that astral travel would be an OBE on purpose, essentially, right? I mean, that's the best way to describe that, I suppose. And when people are speaking about astral travel, they will talk about the silver umbilical cord and don't let that snap, and you got to be connected and all of these things. Do you think that the hands yanking you was actually you, like going, hey, you need to practice this a little more before you just go floating around, dang it? Like, what are you doing? Do you think that it's possible that was you somehow?
Oh, yes. I think at the time I was still traumatized and by what had happened with the UFO and uncovering everything. So I was relating everything back to extraterrestrials. Like literally everything was the aliens. The aliens is them. But yes, now I believe it was me. My brain was like, you're not ready for this. Don't go too far,
That's pretty cool, right? I mean, that's cool. Do you think that, and I don't know if, of course, you would want to do this, seeing as you live in such an active, your land is obviously, it's leaking into the house, I guess is the best way to say it, right? And you're having all these experiences. Do you ever think of actively pursuing trying to tap into all of that kind of stuff again purposely, or you're like, listen, there's enough going on around here?
So about a year ago, I started writing, everything that I sent you, I've been writing for a while now. I really wanted to put it into a kind of creatively written essay about my life and my experiences and relate it back, to things I know now, but how I felt it then. And so I was like, why am I not tapping into this now that I'm more mature and I have a lot more control and I've actually studied different modalities, and why don't I do this? Right. So I would say about a year ago in during meditative states, I have said, whatever wants to reveal itself to me, please do so. And the only thing of note that came from that is I walked in. So I was on a walk with my dogs, and I walked into someone that was not there. I mean, I didn't see them, but I felt them. It was a sensory experience. And I kind of stopped. I was like, I wish I had someone to practice this with, and I don't, right? It's a very kind of lonely, solitary seeking and practice. So I haven't, again, done that, and so nothing else has happened. And if I had a group, like maybe either pagans or just other paranormal seekers who would like to all come together and practice on a regular basis, I probably would do that. But I feel like I need some support in that. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. I think that's a very smart way to go about it instead of just jumping head first in. And I mean, look what happened during that one OBE experience. I think some part of your conscious or unconscious brain just said, listen, Heather, slow your roll. Like this could be a dangerous thing.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So something that you did mention in your email is that because, a lot of times when those of you with the shine have all these different experiences, that can follow a family line. And I find it interesting that in your email you said, well, it does, but it's all surrounded with the women in my family, right? Mm-hmm. But they don't really acknowledge it that much, which, a lot of people are like that. That's fine. They don't put it together. They don't want to, or they do, and they don't want to go further than that. And now you shared that your granddaughter, she's got this sleepwalking going on, and she's like waving at things that aren't there. So again, it's just trickling right down to the women, to the females in the family. I mean, are you
definitely?
I would imagine that, especially you being as sensitive as you are, that you're really keeping an eye out for your granddaughter. Are you more excited for her to see where she takes? Because everybody goes on their own path when it comes to the paranormal. You either you put up the X sign with your fingers, like get the hell away from me, or you become obsessed with it, right? I mean, that's just right. That's how it is. Are you more excited for her, or are you worried?
Yeah, so she lives with us half the week. And so I spend a lot of time with her. And our house is decorated in a very witchy way. It's very like goddess, feminine energy forward decor and mythologies. And I'm teaching her absolutely everything. We've already introduced her to tarot cards and talk to her about why witches are portrayed as they are. I mean, she's 4.5 now, so she's understanding a lot more. I have altars in different parts of my house that she loves. I collect bones and skulls and feathers, and she has been touching these things and seeing these things since she could remember, right? And so I talk to her about everything. She's outside gardening with me, planting things, and we're talking about how it's all part of the same thing. I ask her, I let her know that if she ever sees something that no one else sees, that it's okay to talk about. Now, she hasn't came to us with anything like that, but I want to make sure, because I think part of why I have suffered because of these experiences is because people told me they weren't real. They're not possible. So of course you're not going to talk about them. And when you can't talk about anything, like, then you stuff it down and it comes out in negative ways. I mean, that's true with literally any emotion, any experience, right? So I just want to make sure that she knows that the world is a magical place and a lot of things happen, and you might see things other people don't see, and that's okay. We celebrate. So my partner is Guatemalan and comes from, that culture that celebrates Dia de los Muertos. So during the spooky season, we're celebrating Halloween and Day of the Dead and the fall equinox. So death and spirits, that's all very present in our home. We're a very death positive home. So I am trying to do for her what was never done for me. So yes.
So we have talked about alien abduction experiences, Santa Claus. We have talked about haunting activity, Hatman, mimics, OBEs, UFOs, premonitions. To you, do you think that all of this stuff is connected, or you just, like I said in the beginning, that you're just the flame and these are all separate moths that are just kind of attracted to you?
So I think that it is all a manifestation of one overarching thing. I don't know what that thing is. That thing is the great mystery. I think that thing led to religions. But I do think that it's all the same thing. It is absolutely connected. And I think that when you're sensitive to one aspect, if you start to pay attention, you're sensitive to a lot of different things. And there are things happening all over the place. I really love the writings and philosophy of Jacques Vallée, as well as more modern Nolan. His last name, he's a Harvard scientist. Why is his name
Gary Nolan
leaving me right? Gary Nolan. He talks about a lot of that too, that it's all seems to be pointing to the same thing, which I think kind of bummed me out when I first came across that theory, because I wanted it to all be different. But the more that experiencers come forward and the more that we start to delve into these things, and we have people from the military coming forward talking, it just all seems to be pointing in one direction, if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. And even that whole t-shirt double manifestation thing is so unique and just so weird. I love hearing things like that, because you're going, well, I hear what you just said, and I totally agree that I think it's all connected. It has to be. I'm going, yeah, and then you're going, well, yeah, but where does this fit? Who or what did that, and why? Right? Like, but that's a big thing. Is like, why? Why does he need 2 vegetable T-shirts? I guess he does. Like,
right?
That's so
right.
Cool.
It's so silly, right? But a message that came across to me in a lot of different ways is, don't take this all so seriously. This is all fun and games. And I know that is almost bypassing the fact that there is so much suffering in our world. And I get that. And I'm not trying to explain that away in any way whatsoever. But, you also hear that a lot in Eastern religions, is that we are taking it all in ourselves way too seriously. And so sometimes I feel like that's the great cosmic comedy of it.
God, amen to that. Huge amen to that. People definitely need to lighten up. I have a question. This is definitely just from my own wonderings. Have you ever told all of this out loud while sitting in that very house before?
No. I have never told all of this out loud to one person before.
Wow.
So you're the first to hear it all.
Oh, goodness gracious. Okay, now I'm blushing. That is so cool. All right, so I will be interested to know if, any other activity kicks up, or if the activity you've already had revisits you guys in some way, shape, or form. Not that I'm hoping that happens, because especially the little granddaughter, you don't want her sleepwalking upstairs and things like that. That's
Right.
not good. But yeah, I would like to, of course, know if anything goes down. Heather, thank you a million times over. I didn't even know that you'd never actually even told this to anybody in one sitting. So thank you so much. I'm extremely flattered, and happy birthday tomorrow.
Oh, thank you so much. It was actually very, it seems like an interesting synchronicity that this is all happening right before my birthday and before a new moon. Monday is a new moon. So yeah.
Well, I really enjoyed talking to you today, and a ton of time. I'm sorry for all the technical issues. It happens a lot, don't worry, but especially on these shows, for some reason, I think Heather knocked out power to her whole town. She's got that much power, so don't mess with her. Like I said in the beginning, if she don't like your face, you're going to have problems.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been an honor to be on the podcast.